I have been specifically asked not to talk too much because it is not my lecture. That we have two very capable speakers, starting with the keynote that Professor Beckles will give us. And I was told, just restrict yourself to introducing him and go and sit down and shut up. But before I go and sit down and shut up, and before I introduce him, and before I say something, just to acknowledge Professor Ted Metz, also the respondent today. He will be introduced properly at the right time. The topic is, of course, one that, as South Africans, we cannot minimize or trivialize. It is not a theoretical topic for us as South Africans. Reparations are in many ways what we are grappling with today. We don't always call it reparations. We have found all sorts of nicer, gentler euphemisms to talk about it, but actually it is at the heart of the problems we face in this country. And so it is quite an honor for us to welcome Professor Beckles to talk to us basically about ourselves and about the challenges we face as a country. I was reading an email from March just before I came here, which reminded me that there is 1 billion rands sitting in the office of the president, which is meant for victims of apartheid atrocities, which for some reason is not being spent or not being disbursed. And it came home to me that, in fact, this continues to be a big challenge that we face as a country. Recently, when I was in Europe, in an underground train, someone was trying to persuade me how much Europe transport. I won't mention the country in case you influence them not to give me a visa next time. How much the transport in Europe is so much better and so much faster, and how much they keep to time and all of that. And I was thinking, would they have been able to do all those things without the contribution of the slaves? These things that amaze us today when we look at Europe, when we look at the USA, do we realize how much contribution has come from this continent, not only in sweat, but also in blood? So I look forward to listening to Professor Beckles on this very important topic. Now, let me quickly introduce him so that I can go and sit down as instructed. Professor Sir Hilary Beckles was born in Barbados. He attended secondary school in Barbados and in Birmingham in the UK. He received his higher education in the United Kingdom and graduated with a BA Honours degree in Economic History from Hull University in 1976 and a PhD from the same university in 1980. In 2003, he received an honorary Doctor of Letters for outstanding work as scholar from his alma mater. He joined the History Department at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus in 1979 as lecturer. 1984, he transferred to the Cave campus in Barbados and was promoted to a personal professorship in 1993 at the age of 37. He was just 1 year older than I am now. I am 38. In 1994, he won the first University of the West Indies Vice-Chancellor's Award for Excellence in the field of research. 1998, he was appointed Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Undergraduate Studies. In August 2002, he returned to Cave Hill, this time as Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Principal. Professor Beckles, if I may just add a few more things about him as a scholar. He has received many awards and accolades for his excellence in research and scholarship, 3 honorary doctorates, as I have already mentioned. But it's really his scholarly contribution to the field of Caribbean social and economic history that has been immense. He has written over 20 books and monographs, including Natural Rebels, a social history of enslaved black women in Barbados, centering women, gender discourses in Caribbean slave society, and of course last year he launched his Britain's Black Debt, which is about very much the topic that he will address in part today. So, I could go on and on because I have lots of notes on him. I want to stop here and ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome with me Professor Sir Hilary Beckles.
Distinguished Deputy Vice-Chancellor and colleagues of the University of Johannesburg, all colleagues from academia, members of the diplomatic corps, and friends and students, Dr. Pinky Megwe, who is hosting me here and who invited me to make this presentation. Thank you so very much. It really is a pleasure to be here, and Deputy Vice-Chancellor, I must apologize for my casual attire. So elegantly assembled you are. But I found myself in Soweto a few days ago, and I found a tailor in Soweto. So I had a few locally made shirts. So I am supporting indigenous entrepreneurship. And I have promised to take a few back to the Caribbean, hopefully to establish an import enterprise. But it is really a pleasure to discuss with you in this university environment a subject that is critical to our comprehension of the 21st century and, of course, very dear to all of us who are committed to the advancement of humanity. It is a subject that generates considerable controversy and contention, and for obvious and for logical reasons. I am always more relaxed having this conversation in a university environment because it is the environment I know best. I went to a university at the age of 17 and I have not left. So I am a long server. But I will begin with what I consider to be, first of all, the good news. And the good news is that, in my own opinion, the largest political movement of the 21st century will be the global African reparatory movement. All the continents of the planet will, in my view, experience the surge of Africa and its diasporas, demanding reparatory justice for the crimes against humanity committed in the establishment of European modernity. As you have heard from the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, the rise of the West as an ideological construct is associated with the application of science and technology to production, But it was also predicated on the idea that Africans, as a singular racialized group, could be enslaved on a global basis. And this form of chattel labor, that is, the reduction of persons to the legal status of non-humans and property, could sustain the productivity and efficiency of a new global economic and financial world order. The labor of over 20 million enslaved Africans underpinned the rise of Western modernity. And I should speak not only of the productive labor of enslaved Africans, but also the reproductive labor of enslaved Africans, because in all of these jurisdictions across the New World, women who were the carriers of the status of slavery, their offspring, their children, were born into slavery with the status of property, and therefore the reproductive capacity of enslaved women was equally as important as the importation of Africans. The globalization of African slavery and Western global supremacy, therefore, as you would say, went hand in chin, body and soul. I am not seeking to be deterministic or mechanistic, but when we look at the 16th, 17th, and early 16th, 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, these were the high points of the globalization of African enslavement. This was the period in which we saw the construction of the world's first global labor system. Prior to this period, we cannot see anywhere in human history a unified system of labor organization scattered across such a tremendously large geographical space. African slavery was therefore a global system with regional variations across 3 continents. The transatlantic slave trade was the world's largest commercial enterprise. You do not move 10 to 15 million people across an ocean without the most sophisticated forms of financial and commercial organization. It was also the world's first transcontinental productive system and the largest forced migration in human history. The 19th century saw the eradication of these systems. It was a century of emancipation. It was a century in which, in most jurisdictions in the world, the system of chattel slavery was uprooted, removed. Starting first in Haiti, where the enslaved themselves removed that system and declared in their Constitution of Independence on January the 1st, 1804, that slavery and slave trading are forever forbidden and represented in their constitutions as crimes. We saw in Brazil the final eradication of the slavery system in the last quarter of the 19th century. Brazil was the last of these societies to criminalize the enslavement of persons. And so it took near 100 years of effort, both by the enslaved themselves, by enlightened persons around the world, to eradicate a system that had been in place for 400 years. You do not remove a system that had been in place for 400 years in short time. It was an enormous political effort on the part of the finest minds in the world to bring an end to this global system. We saw in the 20th century the emergence of nation states built primarily by persons who are descendants of the enslaved. And so you might very well say we have come full circle. Leaving this continent as enslaved labor, and today the descendants are the prime ministers and presidents of large numbers of nation states. It is a phenomenal feature of human development. We look into this 21st century now, and we try to imagine what will be the consequences, the gravity, the weight of this historical process impacting upon our futures. And we believe that as a consequence of this history, the 21st century will witness likewise, as a consequence, the world's first grassroots political movement, which will be a movement dedicated to reparatory justice. The question, therefore, is there a certain inevitability about this process? Well, there are some things that we know, again, from the history. And to some extent, we are privileged by the fact that we can reflect upon the Haitian case over 100 years ago, where a society built upon slavery, the largest slave society in the New World, over 500,000 enslaved Africans, rose up with their supporters among the colored community and some supporters among the European and white anti-slavery communities, formed a coalition to remove slavery from the largest slave system in the world, and to establish in its place a nation state dedicated to freedom. It is significant because Haiti was the largest slave society in the New World at the time. Every society in the New World, from Alaska in the north to Argentina in the south, every single economic system across that entire continent was built with slave labor. And here was one society in the middle of it all declaring that slavery is a crime against humanity. Now, this is very significant because we have to look to see how the Haitians went about building a nation state. The first thing they sought to do was to reinsert themselves into the world economy. It was the largest producer of cane sugar, one of the largest producers of coffee, one of the largest importers of African persons. It was classified using standard economic criteria as the wealthiest plantation system the world had ever seen. But it was all destroyed by 15 years of civil war and revolution. The Haitian leadership, the Haitian revolutionary leadership, looking into the future, decided that the way forward was to reinsert this nation into the world economy. And the way to do this was to re-establish the plantation system that had been the basis of social concern. This became quite interesting because Toussaint Louverture, who led this revolution, argued that the plantation system on which 500,000 Africans had been enslaved was a system of large-scale production, a system of export orientation, a system to earn foreign exchange, a system that would employ thousands of workers, and therefore the structure of the slave economy ought to be re-established. And this was the first primary decision taken by the revolutionary leadership. And so the plantation system was rebuilt. The enslaved themselves had fought a war because they believed that at the end of it, there would have been land reform. There would have been land redistribution. They would have been converted into peasants, into commercial farmers. They would have been converted into owners of properties, and freedom will be based upon that ownership. Instead, they were told by their new government to return to work as laborers on the estates owned by the persons who had enslaved them. What followed in Haiti was a process of disenchantment on a popular basis. And for the next 40 years, what we witnessed was a revolution within the revolution. The workers themselves rose up against their new governments. The new governments brought out the army to oppress the uprisings of the workers. The workers insisted this is not what we fought for. The government insisted we have to globalize our economy, our society. We have to earn foreign exchange, and we have to stay modern. And Haiti became an unstable social formation. The rest, as you say, is history. The society spiraled further and further into political chaos, into economic ruin. It was a choice which was made. This is a very significant choice because the workers had expected reparations, they had expected economic enfranchisement, they had expected economic empowerment to follow the process of slavery. It's important, I believe, to look also at all of the subsequent economies that have undertaken this process of nation building against the background of crimes against humanity. From the early 19th century through to the middle of the 20th century and beyond, where we have seen many new and emerging nation states, all confronted with the same phenomenon. How to proceed? How do we balance the needs of an expectant population with the realization of integration into a global economy? In all of these societies we have looked at, especially those in the Caribbean, it is fair to conclude that there remains to this day fundamental disenchantment with the systems that were put in place at independence. Jamaica, just last year, celebrated 50 years of independence, 50 years of nation building. The British had colonized Jamaica in 1655 and had ruled Jamaica for 300 years. At the end of that process, when Jamaica became an independent nation, 75% of the black people in Jamaica were illiterate. A community, therefore, of 75% illiteracy was asked to build a modern nation, and to do so within the context of inadequate reform in relation to reparatory justice. We are all today very concerned about the social issues in Jamaica, the ghettoization of the population, the challenges associated with an underclass, the difficulties associated with social dispossession, and a belief that the system of state administration does not represent justice. This is a model that can be applied across the entire Caribbean. That despite a commitment to democracy, a popular commitment, there remains disenchantment with the relationships of governance. And why is this? The history of slavery has left behind a phenomenal legacy. The legacy is seen in these societies on a daily basis. In all of these societies, the black community, who represents the majority, are economically marginalized and disenfranchised. In my own island of Barbados, that is known not only for its tourism, but for its cricketing genius. And my brother, who was with me here this evening, was one such aspirant to West Indies cricket status. But all of us grew up in the search of that excellence. But when we examined why there was this popular obsession among the black community with cricket, it was because it was the only way out of the ghetto. It was the only way out of poverty. Now, the independence model that was built in Barbados, and I was an independence baby. I entered high school at the age of 10, precisely in our independence year. And it was argued that the independence process was fought for in order to empower my generation. But the division of labor, which was established for governance, remains problematic 47 years later. The system was that the white community that had monopolized the economic resources of the island for 300 years, who were the descendants of the enslavers, would remain in possession of the management of the economy, and the vast majority of the black people, 97% of the citizens, who are in control of the political process, have established a system whose sustainability is now being questioned. Despite the fact that the white community of Barbados owns 70% of the capital on the island and are the owners of the entrepreneurial system, there are no white persons in the elected parliament of the island. It is because the black community refuses to elect white citizens into the parliament. The white citizens will say, therefore, that we are going to control the senior and elite management of the companies, of the corporations. We will monopolize the wealth, and therein we have a standoff. The biggest challenge facing this society and many other societies in the Caribbean is how to get beyond this, how to move beyond this, how to say that this is not sustainable, it is not a system of equality and justice, and it is not a 21st century system of governance. The process of bringing the two sides together in order to build a sustainable democracy remains a primary challenge 47 years after independence. This is of great concern to all of us who are irretrievable believers in the fundamental equality of all human beings and the rights to justice for everyone. Now, the Reparatory Discussion says the following things. Justice is crafted by human agency. It requires philosophical reflection and the production of philosophical knowledge. It requires, importantly, persons who will stand in defense of the principle of equality in all areas of life. And it requires, fundamentally, persons who are prepared to make sacrifices in defense of these values. In recent times, we have seen the civil society movement in the Caribbean pushing aggressively for a discussion in respect of reparatory justice. We have entered into conversations with European governments. In fact, I was the principal spokesman for the Caribbean nations at the Durban conference here in 2001, the United Nations Conference on Race, Xenophobia, and Intolerance. And we sought to discuss these matters in an environment best suited to formulate a new vision, the United Nations Forum. The position of the European nations and Durban were clear: that there can be no discussion at an intergovernmental level in respect of reparations because no crime had been committed. The position of all of the European nations that were engaged in the slave trade and slavery in Durban and since has been that slavery was not illegal because the governments of Europe had legalized the process. And slave trading was not illegal because the parliaments of Europe had deemed this form of commerce to be legal. Now, one might very well respond to this by saying that the crimes against humanity committed against the Jewish community in Germany and in other parts of Europe, and the Holocaust against the Jewish community, that it was also legal because the German parliament had also legalized it. But the critical thing is that international law recognizes that when crimes are committed against humanity, those who commit those crimes cannot hide behind national law. National law is no protector of persons who commit crimes against humanity. Then we were told by the European Union, who represented the Western discourse, that these crimes, if they could be so recognized, took place a very long time ago and are now too remote to be subject to recuperatory discussions. And the theory of remoteness, which is embedded in British common law, where time expires, suggests that this cannot be subject to discussion in any court of law. But the countervailing principle, of course, is that of human memory, of living memory. A crime is not considered too remote if it is within living memory. There are people in the Caribbean whose grandparents were African slaves. There are still households in the Caribbean where the memory of slavery exists in elders who were transported to the Caribbean in the 19th century and whose grandchildren were raised by these enslaved persons. It is therefore not remote in that context. Neither is it remote in Brazil, where slavery was abolished, as I have said, in the 1880s, 2 generations ago in terms of living memory. Then we were told, and you might very well find this if you examine the discussions in the British House of Parliament in 2007, when Parliament engaged in conversation in respect of the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade. The British Parliament concluded that even if we are prepared to accept that these were crimes, these crimes were too large to be subject to meaningful conversation. That the crime of slavery and slave trading were so large, the enormity of it, the global scope of it, the magnitude of it, was far too large to be subject to a conversation in a court of law or in any established tribunal. It's just too large. And one of the finest statements of this came from Lord Morris of Handsworth, who is a Jamaican who grew up in Britain from Jamaica and distinguished himself as a trade unionist. And he argued in the House of Lords that while his foreparents were enslaved in Jamaica, and he feels very strongly about that, as a descendant of the slaves, he isn't sure where to begin. He says, my imagination cannot comprehend the scope of a conversation to deal with this tragic development. And it is so large that the best thing to do is to close the books, forget it, and move on. And that was his contribution to that conversation in the House of Lords. I had the pleasure of meeting him in Jamaica and telling him that my imagination can comprehend the conversation. Then, two members of the British House of Parliament, of the Commons, rose and told the Speaker that they will not support a reparatory conversation simply because African peoples have an unlimited capacity for human forgiveness. And that he had traveled throughout Africa, and what impressed him more than any other feature was the capacity of African peoples to forgive. And therefore he would call upon them to do so in this context. But much more aggressively were those arguments that stated that since the nation building project had commenced in these post-slavery and post-apartheid societies, that European governments had given millions of dollars of aid to these countries, and that aid was in lieu of reparations. And furthermore, that the failure of political leadership in these societies to eradicate poverty, but instead to preside over the increase of poverty. And there are some societies where the level of poverty has intensified since the nation building project commenced. That this had to do with black incompetence in respect of governance. That there is a cultural problem of incompetence in governance in black communities, and therefore no reparations can resolve that problem. Now, these are the arguments that you are asked to contend with in an effort to see if the future can be crafted in an orderly and civilized fashion. There was also the question of intimidation. There is no doubt that most of these new nation states, their leaderships, felt intimidated by the global order. Many prime ministers, many presidents, many ministers of governments will say to you, if we brought this discussion into our parliaments, we will have to answer to the World Bank, we will have to answer to the IMF, we will have to answer to multinational corporations, and we will have to answer to investors, to global investors. Now, we can conclude then that there is a deep polarization in the world on this question. Reparations has been conceptualized as the antithesis to aid. It has been conceptualized as a retreat from forgiveness. Some African governments instead, especially those in West Africa, have argued for something called the New African Initiative. In Durban in 2001, we were told by 3 or 4 very large and prominent African states, primarily Nigeria, Senegal, and Ghana, states that exported over 80% of those persons who found themselves across the Middle Passage. The sending nations, so to speak, that they were not going to participate in a conversation in respect to reparations, but instead they were promoting something called the New African Initiative, which when analyzed really represents the World Bank's formulation for direct foreign investment in those societies. But there's also the question of the relationship between reparations and economic globalization. Many political leaders in these new nation states would argue that the promotion of a discourse of reparatory justice would in some way, somehow, undermine the potential of these nations to move aggressively and positively into the globalized world economy. One can conclude that this represents either a form of rationality or a justification of fear, maybe of intellectual weakness, but we do not know. It is for these leaders to determine this. But where I stand on this conversation, on the other side of the fence, is this. This is a remarkable opportunity and a wonderful moment for us to invite philosophers and intellectuals who have been a part of the Western Enlightenment model to truly present to the world a genuine and sincere enlightened vision. I have not been convinced by the 17th century Enlightenment discourse. And all of us who received the Western education also know the contradictions and the challenges deeply embedded in that. And I was saying to my brother just this afternoon, as an undergraduate, I spent most of my time as a student in political science and philosophy. And when I heard the name Dr. Parekh, I must say I panicked a little bit, because at Hull University, Dr. Parekh, who was the distinguished political scientist who taught us all political science, and he was very keen to indicate to us that John Locke, who we all grew up on, theories of liberty, the conceptualization of the free order, the greatest, arguably the greatest Western philosopher on liberty and justice, that while John Locke was formulating these very valuable treatises, he was also an owner of slaves in the Caribbean. He was an owner of a cotton plantation with slaves in the Bahamas, and he was the corporate secretary of the Royal African Company, which was the largest slave trading company in the 17th century. When Locke therefore sought to articulate his philosophical views about justice and liberty, and he had influenced the whole Western world with his thought, how did he reconcile all of this with his status as a slave owner and a slave trader? He said there was nothing to reconcile, because the Africans were not humans. And since they were not humans, they were not subject to his philosophical treatise. They were not a part of the discourse of freedom and liberty and justice. They were pre-human. And by being pre-human, slavery became a school through which they graduated into humanity. And in that formulation, therefore, the 300 years of African enslavement was the process through which Africans were able to graduate into a humanity. But we see this right through the Western discourse. We see this right through the Western Enlightenment. But this is an opportunity for Western philosophy to come to the table and to speak about reparatory justice. that the Western world that had built its economic infrastructure of development and industrialization and growth upon slavery and slave trading and the genocide of native peoples, that this is an opportunity for those philosophers to say that the 21st century requires a new formulation that will bring a high level of human agency to all of us in the 21st century. It is a challenge we put to them. It's a challenge that the West has to redeem its intellectual tradition. It's a challenge that the West has to, in fact, capture the high ground in global Western discourse. This is going to be very, very important. Very, very important indeed. Because reparations is a quasi-legal process that enters into courts of law, into political tribunals, where people are saying that they have a right to be repaired in terms of the damage that has been done to them and to their offspring. Western law recognizes the importance of all of this. It is a principle that is embedded in the finest jurisprudence of the world. The challenge has been how to give effect to it, how to implement it. There are many positions that problematizes the legal conversations. The British government, for example, have said the judiciary will not receive any case of reparation in respect of any crime against humanity committed in their colonies before 1954. So that any massacre, any slavery, any wanton murder of people, any of those crimes before 1954 will not be allowed onto the agenda of their judicial system. As you all know, the Momo case took place before 1954. And that was only heard because the judge ruled that the government of Britain had tampered with the evidence. And by tampering with the evidence surrounding the suppression of the Momo, it was incumbent upon the court to hear the truth. And that case got into the court through a technicality of the British government tampering with the evidence. There was discussions about documents taken from the archives and hidden in remote places of England, and some documents destroyed. And the judge felt he had no choice but to say, well, if the evidence of these crimes are being removed from public scrutiny, maybe we ought to hear it. And that is how that case went through. And even then, that was not a case of reparations. I attended the 8th Pan-African Congress here this week, and we made it very clear in conversations that we have to distinguish between reparations and settlement. You know, the Japanese, in their invasion of Korea during the war, and the soldiers brought all of those Japanese women into their camps and used them as sex slaves, and that case went before the World Court. The Japanese government looked at that case before it got to litigation and offered a settlement instead. All of those women who were the descendants of those victims, and millions of yen were put into a fund called the Korean Women Development Fund. And this fund was established to rehabilitate those persons who had suffered damage, their parents, grandparents, and so on. But that was a settlement. And the question is, what is the difference between a settlement and reparations? It is very simple. With a settlement, you do not apologize. With a settlement, you do not take responsibility. With a settlement, you do not acknowledge that you commit a crime. With a settlement, you merely say We recognized that harm had been done to some communities, individuals, peoples. And an effort to assist those persons, we offer a financial sum in lieu of apology. And the sum is taken and the subject is closed legally. Reparations calls for an acknowledgement that a crime had been committed, a willingness to take responsibility for the consequences of the crime, and a commitment to repair the damage that has been done. That is what reparatory justice says. So you begin with acknowledgement, you begin with taking responsibility, and that is how the process goes. If you do not wish to go that way, you then say, well, here's a sum of money, take it and go away. Thank you. The governments of the Caribbean have recently decided to take this matter on board. At the end of last year, after 50 years of civil society debate, after 50 years of governments in the Caribbean refusing to acknowledge the reparatory conversation, after 50 years of suppressing reparatory conversations, civil society campaign became so intense that they were forced to bring it on board. At the end of last year, the Caribbean heads of governments moved to establish a Caribbean Reparations Commission. Oh, sorry. So, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. Thanks.
Just give a check, please.
This commission was established by unanimous resolution of the heads of governments. 17 governments, all in the meeting, agreed to establish this commission. This commission has been asked to prepare the historical evidence, the sociological, cultural, psychological evidence that establishes the continuing harm and suffering of Caribbean African peoples resulting from slavery and colonization, with a view to having a conversation with the governments of Europe who built these slave systems and who benefited from these slave systems, with a view to establishing a reparatory process. Civil society thus far have identified 10 areas where the African population continues to suffer harm, and these areas will more than likely become the basis of a reparatory conversation with the governments of Western Europe. The reparations conversation is therefore linked to a developmental model. The basis of this commission is to remove all elements of confrontation from the dialogue in respect of reparations. The basis of this commission is that reparations is not about confrontation. It's about finding a sustainable path to reconciliation. That while the truth must be told and reconciliation must be the ultimate objective of human society, reparatory justice is an indispensable part of that equation. And so a number of areas have been identified for treatment and for discussions. I will very quickly mention some of these before I bring the presentation to closure. First of all, the apology. It is believed that African peoples will not find closure until an apology is granted. And if this apology takes 1,000 years, it will still be demanded. Because there can be no closure until persons are granted an apology. In other words, you cannot enslave people for 400 years, deny them in law their human status, classify them as property and real estate, bring an end to the process, and do not apologize for it. The European governments have all issued, at the moment, statements of regret. A statement of regret is considered in the Caribbean to be insufficient. A statement of regret merely recognizes that harm continues to exist and for which you are sorry. But a statement of regret does not acknowledge your responsibility for what you have done, neither does it recognize your duty to participate in the upliftment of those whom you have victimized. And so, the statements of regrets have been rejected. The apology is considered an indispensable part of the healing of these societies and the search for justice that is sustainable and also human reconciliation. There's also the question of repatriation. Over 50 million people were stolen from this continent and sold across the world. It was not their choice. It was not their intention. They were just stolen and sold. Their descendants have expressed a desire to return from whence they came. This is considered to be a right. In most enlightened countries in the world, laws make provision for such persons to be returned and settled and given citizenship in those places from which they were taken. We believe that this is an absolutely indispensable part of the process. At the moment, I know there are probably 20 or 30,000 Caribbean Africans who have returned to live in African societies. We also know that they continue to suffer some harm in these societies because they do not get citizenship. Their children are denied citizenship. And this, of course, in my view, is a breach of human rights. There's a question of health. This is particularly disturbing to all of us in the Caribbean. For those of you who are looking at the Caribbean world through South Africa and you see all of our great cricketers, or all of our used to be great cricketers, and you see all of our great athletes, the fastest man in the world, the fastest woman in the world, the second fastest man and the second fastest woman, and you say, my word, those African people in the Caribbean, they are really fit. The fact is that that image glosses over the fundamental truth that the African people in the Caribbean are the unhealthiest people on this planet if we take the criterion of chronic diseases as our measurement. African people in the Caribbean have the highest incidence in the world of type 2 diabetes and hypertension. In fact, over 60% of all black people in the Caribbean over the age of 60 have either hypertension, diabetes, or both. Our medical scientists have shown that this is linked directly to the stress profile experienced by these people during slavery and colonization. And the interesting feature of this is that the same characteristics do not exist in West Africa. And the only other part of the world that has the same pathological conditions are the states of Mississippi and Alabama in the US for the same reason. Which would suggest that these Africans have been taken through a process of physical transformation, emotional transformation that have rendered them unhealthy. If you add to that the fact that the drugs that are used to treat hypertension in the Caribbean, most of these drugs are clinically tried on Caucasians. And Caucasians do have a 90 to 95% response to these drugs. The remarkable thing is that West Africans have the same response as Caucasians to these drugs. So these drugs that treat hypertension among Europeans are also very effective in treating hypertension in West Africans. 90 to 95% response. But in the African Caribbean population, it is 65%. The question, therefore, is, if you take my own situation, my ancestors are out of West Africa. They have a 95% response. We in the Caribbean, we have a 65% response. But we are their genetic heirs. So what has happened between West Africa and the Caribbean? It is the impact of slavery and colonization. And so we say to the pharmaceutical companies, how are we going to carry out the biochemical research to have these drugs adjusted so that we could bring the Caribbean black response up to the same level as West Africa and European? And they said, well, there are only 15 million. There are only 15 million Africans in the Caribbean. It's too small a market. If it was an African problem, we would invest in research. But we're not going to spend all of that money to cure a problem for 15 million people. And so the Caribbean Africans, victimized as slaves, are now victimized again as free persons, and are dying at a rate much higher than their West African ancestors, and at the same time, their European enslavers and their descendants. So they are doubly victimized if we take this. These are the kind of issues that the Caribbean Reparations Commission will be treating with. Because something has to be done to repair the public health catastrophe in the Caribbean around chronic diseases. Then we have questions of illiteracy. The book I wrote on the question, Britain Black Debt, identifies all of the major government structures, companies, royal families, aristocratic leaders, corporations, banks, insurance companies that generated millions of dollars out of their ownership. I see my colleague here has a copy of the book. On the cover of that book is a wonderful photograph. It shows Queen Elizabeth, our queen, visiting Barbados in 1966. And our queen is visiting Barbados to visit the sugar plantation of her first cousin, the 7th Earl of Harewood. On the surface, there's nothing wrong with that. The queen goes down to the Caribbean to visit her cousin on his sugar plantation. That's fine. That's okay, that's okay. This plantation had been in his family from 1782, when the first Earl of Harewood bought this estate of 300 acres and 232 enslaved Africans on it. From the 1780s down to 1975, this family owned the sugar plantations and all within it. It was the basis of one of the largest fortunes established. In fact, in the 1780s, the Lascelles family that owned over 8,000 Africans across the Caribbean was classified as the richest common family in England. And they arrived in the Caribbean as poor. John Lascelles had £5 in his pocket. 130 years later, his great-great-great-grandson is a wealthiest man in Britain, with the third biggest castle. And he brought his slaves from the Caribbean to build his castle in England. The King of England said, I cannot have a man who is so wealthy without a title. And so he was given a peerage and he became the first Earl of Harewood. And the properties passed down to the second Earl, the third Earl, the fourth Earl. In 1922, the fifth Earl married Princess Mary, the King's daughter. And so the slaveocracy married into the monarchy, married beautiful young Princess Mary. And as a result, the eighth Earl and the Queen become first cousins. And so she comes to visit her cousin's plantation. And on that plantation, most of the people working on it were the descendants of the enslaved. But the relationship between that conversation and reparatory justice is not taking place. It's not taking place. But surely, the 21st century cannot bury this history on the beach. It has to be made available for everyone to have a conversation. When I met a few months ago the ninth Earl, the current Earl, charming man, David Lascelles, very decent chap. The tragic thing about our meeting in Barbados was that when he came to Barbados, it was the first time he had ever come to Barbados. And he was 49 years old. And his family's fortune had been built on Barbadian slavery. And one of the estates that his ancestors built and owned, it was an estate on which my brother and I grew up, the Turner Hall estate. That was the estate where my grandfather worked as a laborer. And I told the Earl, well, you know, you and I must talk. Because we are bonded by history. We are bonded by a common history. The Earl have said that his family is committed to a reparatory process. It is a commendable effort. He and his wife, the Duchess, are now among the largest sponsors, investors in black art in Britain. They sponsor museums, art festivals, art conferences, and they are now a major investor in the creative arts for the black community in Great Britain. And that is commendable. It's a very good beginning of one family taking that step. Then we have to deal with the question, for example, of museums. In Britain, there are 7 museums dedicated to the history of slavery. There isn't one in the Caribbean. There isn't one museum to slavery or slave trading in the Caribbean. Now, am I going to ask the government of Jamaica, Barbados, or Trinidad to take $20 million US and invest in a museum to slavery when they're all suffering balance of payment problems and debt issues? Who should take responsibility for building those educational institutions in the Caribbean, where children can go and see this history, where adults can go and engage in conversation? Who really have the responsibility to develop these institutions of learning for the next generation? I believe that these are matters that ought to be part of a reparatory process. We are so concerned about growing illiteracy. It becomes a matter of moral responsibility. I have said to 2 British Prime Ministers that they should not walk away from the Caribbean having built their nation upon its exploitation and leave all of those African people illiterate and in ill health. It's a moral crisis that should be addressed. Their position is that we are now in the European Union and all of that history is behind us. We have joined the European Union and the colonial history is behind us. Our position is that is an opening response, but you will have to come back to the table. Because sooner or later, a time is going to come when someone is going to say, every black person on this planet will not go to work on a given day until the world recognizes that this 500-year-old crime has to be discussed. Now you can very well imagine how that will focus the imagination. And it will focus the imagination. But these are the kinds of issues that are before us as we look into this century. I was very pleased that the Pan-African Congress this afternoon adopted resolutions calling for the establishment of national reparations commissions in all countries of the world where there are African peoples, with a view to establishing a global international reparations commission that will address this matter on a global scale. They have argued in opposition that there is nothing unique or specific about the African experience. All races, all classes, all ethnicities in the world have all experienced an enslavement at some point or another in their historical development. That might very well be true, but there is something absolutely new and unprecedented about the African experience. Firstly, it was the first time in human history that an entire race of people were classified as property, non-human, and real estate. It was the first time in human history that a given legal status was assigned specifically and exclusively to one group of peoples. And it was the first time in human history that that circumstance was developed on a global scale. So what we are speaking about then is something altogether unique. And to the extent that it became a global phenomenon, the entire world has to deal with it. The ideology of black enslavement as a norm was accepted by societies where persons had never even encountered Africans. There are societies where the oral history demonstrates people believe that Africans ought to be slaves, and they had not before in their entire history seen an African. But the idea had traveled into their community because the idea had become globalized. And this is an interesting situation. We have done oral history in parts of China. We have done oral history in parts of Japan where people have not met Africans before, but they believe that all Africans are slaves because the language had traveled into their societies by the power of the Western media in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. The idea had traveled and taken root. And so I offer these ideas, not so much as an intervention in the domestic affairs of South Africa or any society, but merely to state that many countries have walked this road before. The first country to walk this road, as I have said, it was Haiti. The Caribbean has walked this road 50 years ago, and now you are walking this road. But what they all have in common, from Haiti, the Caribbean, right through, is massive popular discontent with the arrangements that were put in place. And therefore, I would suggest that if we learn anything from history, if we can learn anything from history, it is that if we are concerned with the commitment to humanity, we have to use our finest imaginations, our deepest moral sense of outrage, and we must commit ourselves to the application of the finest thoughts to resolve these problems. If we walk blindly into the future, in ignorance of this history, we will find ourselves repeating the history in one place after another, after another, after another. I thank you.